The Wyoming sky was a flat, unforgiving sheet of blue, bleached pale at the edges by a sun that had been relentless since dawn. Elijah Brooks rode with his shoulders settled into a familiar ache, the rhythm of his horse's gait a steady, lulling comfort against the vast emptiness of the plains. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Stout, plodded on with the uncomplaining endurance of an animal born to this land. The wagon they led, loaded with sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and salted pork, kicked up a fine, choking dust that clung to Elijah's clothes and settled in the lines around his eyes. He was heading for the Miller Ranch, a good 2 days' ride north. Old John Miller had passed a month ago, a sickness taking him quick and quiet in his sleep. And Elijah had promised his widow he would bring supplies before the first snows threatened to close the passes. It was the kind of promise he always kept. He was a man built of quiet oaths and unspoken duties, a solitary figure moving through a world that had long ago taken more from him than it had given. He was polite to strangers, fair in his dealings, and never stayed in one place long enough for roots to take hold. A deep and ancient grief clung to him like the prairie dust, a shadow that the brightest sun could not burn away. Sometimes, when the wind moaned just so across the grasslands, he would hear a woman's laughter in it, a sound so clear and painful it made his hands clench the reins until his knuckles were white. Then the memory would fade, leaving only the hollow ache behind, a ghost limb of a life that was no more. By late afternoon, the unblinking horizon was broken by a smudge of smoke and the low, jagged shapes of buildings. Sundown Ridge. The name was fitting. It was a place where decency seemed to set with the sun, leaving the darkness to be ruled by hard men and harder liquor. It was a scab of a town, festering on the main trail, with a single dusty street flanked by unpainted, weather-beaten structures leaning against each other for support. There was a blacksmith, a general store with boarded-up windows, and a livery stable that looked one strong wind away from collapse. But the heart of the town, its loud and pulsing core, was Silas's watering hole, a saloon whose reputation for cheap whiskey and trafficked women had spread 100 miles in every direction. Elijah had no love for such places, but Stout needed water and his own stomach was a hollow pit. He pulled the wagon to a halt before the long trough outside the saloon, the raucous sounds of a badly tuned piano and coarse laughter spilling out from behind the swinging doors. He worked the pump until fresh, cool water gushed into the trough, letting Stout and the 2 draft horses drink their fill. He ran a hand down his horse's neck, murmuring a few low words, his touch gentle and sure. A man's character could be judged by how he treated his animals, and Elijah treated his with a quiet respect he rarely afforded to people. With the horses tended to, he straightened up and squared his shoulders, his gaze resting on the saloon doors. He could eat the dry jerky in his saddlebag, but a hot meal was a temptation he hadn't the will to resist. Taking a deep breath of the dusty air, he pushed through the doors and stepped inside. The change from the bright, open prairie was jarring. The air was thick with the stench of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap perfume. A haze of blue smoke hung in the air, catching the weak light that filtered through the grimy windows. The room was crowded with rough-looking men, trappers in buckskin, prospectors with wild, hopeful eyes, and cowboys whose faces were burned to leather by the sun. They were loud and belligerent, their voices a constant, rumbling growl. Elijah found an empty table in a corner, a spot that let him keep his back to the wall and watch the room. He placed his hat on the table and sat, his movements economical and deliberate. He was not a large man, but there was a stillness about him, a coiled composure that suggested he was not to be trifled with. He waited, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced, neutral expression. That was when he saw her. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, a pale, slender girl in a plain brown dress that hung loosely on her frame. She was carrying a tray of drinks, her steps so light she barely seemed to stir the sawdust on the floor. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the sharp angles of her face. She kept her eyes downcast, fixed on the precarious balance of whiskey glasses. Her entire being focused on the task of serving without being seen, of existing without being noticed. She was a stark and jarring contrast to the other women in the saloon, whose faces were painted into hard masks of cheerfulness, their laughter too loud, their dresses too bright. This girl was silent, colorless. The life had been bled out of her, leaving behind an empty vessel. But it was her eyes that held Elijah's attention when she finally, briefly, lifted her head. They were a watery, washed-out blue, and they were utterly, devastatingly hollow. It was a look he knew well. He saw it in his own reflection sometimes, in the dark surface of a river at dusk. It was the look of someone who had witnessed the world burn down around them and was left to walk through the ashes. The narrator's voice, had it chosen to speak, would have named her Clara Bell. It would have told of her father, a preacher who spoke of God's grace but was undone by man's greed, falling into a debt he could never repay. It would have told of his sudden death, leaving Clara and her mother destitute, and of the day Silas, the saloon's owner, came to collect. Her mother, frail and broken, had traded the only thing she had left of value, her daughter's servitude. Clara was untouched, a fact Silas lorded over her as both a promise and a threat, but she was far from unharmed. The bruises were on the inside, deep in the place where faith and hope used to live. Her posture was a study in defense, her shoulders slightly hunched as if expecting a blow, the tray held before her like a shield. A hulking trapper with a greasy beard and a booming laugh reached out and snagged her by the wrist as she passed. "Hey now, pretty thing. Spare a smile for old Jed?" Clara flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her body. A glass rattled on her tray. She said nothing, her gaze fixed on a knot in the wooden floor. "What's the matter, girl? Too good for the likes of us?" Jed's grip tightened, his grin turning cruel. "Silas paid good money for you. The least you can do is look grateful." He gave her arm a rough shake, and a splash of whiskey sloshed over the rim of a glass and onto her hand. The girl's lips pressed into a thin, white line, but she remained silent, a statue of terrified endurance. Elijah watched from his corner. He felt a familiar, cold anger begin to uncoil in his gut. It was the kind of anger that had no heat, no fire, only a terrible, patient weight. He had seen bullies like Jed his whole life, men who mistook cruelty for strength and fear for respect. He had seen what they did to the weak, the vulnerable, the innocent. He had seen the fires they started. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood on wood was a small, sharp sound, but in that corner of the saloon, it cut through the noise. He rose to his feet and walked toward the trapper, his steps unhurried, his spurs making no sound in the thick sawdust. He stopped beside the table, his shadow falling over both the man and the girl. He did not look at Jed. His eyes were on Clara's hand, where the man's thick, grimy fingers were digging into her pale flesh. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, devoid of any emotion except a profound and unshakable certainty. "Let the girl go." Jed looked up, his eyes bleary with drink and surprise. He saw Elijah standing there, a plain-looking man in dusty clothes, and he sneered. "And who are you to be giving orders? Stranger." Elijah finally lifted his gaze and met the trapper's eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his stare was more potent than any shout. "I'm the man telling you to let her go." For a long moment, the saloon seemed to hold its breath. The piano player's fingers faltered on the keys. Conversations trailed off. Everyone was watching. Jed's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He was bigger than Elijah, stronger by the look of him, but there was something in the stranger's eyes, a promise of consequence, a complete lack of fear, that gave him pause. He looked from Elijah's calm, steady face to the girl's terrified one, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. With a grumbled curse, He released her wrist. "She ain't worth the trouble nohow," he muttered, turning back to his drink. Elijah said nothing more. He gave a slight nod, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, and turned back toward his table. The tension in the room broke. The piano started up again, a little too loudly, and the hum of conversation resumed. Clara stood frozen for a second, rubbing her wrist, her eyes darting toward Elijah with a look of stunned disbelief. Then she saw Silas, the saloon owner, leaning against the bar, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was a thundercloud. He jerked his head toward the back room, a silent, furious command. The girl's face went even paler. She gave a jerky nod, her whole body trembling, and hurried away, disappearing through a door behind the bar. Elijah saw the exchange. He saw the fear in her eyes and the cold, proprietary anger in Silas's. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his stomach like a stone, that he had not saved her from anything. He had only delayed her punishment. Later, with a plate of stew and a chunk of bread before him, he ate in silence, the food tasteless in his mouth. He paid the bartender, his manners as always polite and reserved, and left the suffocating atmosphere of the saloon for the clean and cool air of the coming evening. He declined the offer of a room for the night, the thought of sleeping under the same roof as the man who owned that girl, body and soul. Turning his stomach, he would bed down in the stable. He preferred the company of horses anyway. The stable was dark and quiet, filled with the comforting scents of hay and animals. He found an empty stall, spread his bedroll, and lay down, using his saddle as a pillow, but sleep would not come. Through the thin wooden walls, he could hear the faint, tinny music from the saloon, a sound that grated on his nerves. He thought of the girl, of her hollow eyes and the red marks Jed's fingers had left on her wrist. He thought of the look on Silas's face. He closed his eyes and saw flames, heard a scream carried on the wind. The old grief was a living thing inside him, and tonight it was restless. He must have drifted off, because he was woken sometime later by a sound. It was soft, almost lost in the nicker of a nearby horse and the sigh of the wind through the cracks in the stable walls. It was the sound of someone trying to cry without making a noise. A series of small, choked-off sobs, muffled and desperate. Elijah sat up, every sense alert. He listened, his head cocked, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from the next stall over. He rose silently to his feet and peered over the wooden partition. In the dim moonlight filtering through a grimy window, he saw her. It was the girl from the saloon, Clara. She was curled into a tight ball in the straw, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She had pulled an old, threadbare blanket around herself, but it offered little protection from the cold or the cruelty of the world. He watched her for a long moment, a war of impulses fighting within him. The part of him that was bound by duty and a hard-won pragmatism told him to leave her be. This was not his fight. He was just passing through. Getting involved would only bring trouble, and he had known enough trouble for one lifetime. But another part of him, the part that remembered a gentle hand on his cheek and the weight of a small child in his arms, could not turn away. He swung his legs over the partition and dropped noiselessly into the straw beside her. She gasped and scrambled back, her head whipping around, her eyes wide with fear in the gloom. He could see now the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, and a small cut on her lower lip that had bled. "It's just me," he said, his voice a low rumble. He kept his distance, holding his hands up slightly to show he meant no harm. Her fear slowly subsided, replaced by a wary, defensive anger. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and glared at him, her chin jutting out. "What do you want?" "Nothing. I heard you crying." "I wasn't crying," she snapped, her voice raspy. She hastily wiped at her wet cheeks with the back of her hand. "Don't you feel sorry for me?" It wasn't a request. It was a command, fierce and proud. Elijah simply nodded. accepting her words without argument. He knew pride. It was often the last thing a person had left. She seemed to take his silence as a challenge. "I chose this," she said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with defiance. "It was this or watch my mother starve. So don't you stand there looking at me with pity. I don't want it." Elijah looked at this bruised, broken, and impossibly proud girl, and he felt not pity, but a deep, aching sense of recognition. He saw a soul as cornered by life as his own had once been. He said nothing. Words were useless things in a moment like this. They were stones you threw into a canyon, and you never heard them land. Instead, he shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, the one that had kept him warm through more bitter nights than he could count. He folded it once and held it out to her. It was a simple gesture, an offer of warmth, nothing more. Clara stared at the coat as if it were a snake. Her eyes flickered from the dark wool to his face, searching for a trick, a price, a hidden expectation. She saw none. She only saw a quiet man with sad eyes, offering a small piece of comfort in a cold, hard world. Her pride warred with the shivering in her bones. Finally, she shook her head. A sharp, jerky movement. She would not take it. She would not be indebted to anyone, not even for a moment's warmth. Elijah did not press her. He simply placed the folded coat on the straw between them, a silent offering left on an altar of pride and pain. He retreated to his side of the stall but did not leave. He sat down, leaning his back against the rough wooden boards, and closed his eyes, a silent guardian in the darkness. Clara watched him, her breath catching in her throat. He had not tried to rescue her. He had not offered platitudes or false hope. He had simply offered his coat. She didn't accept it, but she also didn't tell him to leave. And in the shared silence of the dusty stable, with the smell of hay and horses all around them, a single, fragile thread of trust was spun in the dark. Dawn broke thin and gray, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. Elijah was awake before the first light, his movements quiet and purposeful as he checked the wagon and hitched the draft horses. He left his coat lying on the straw where he had placed it the night before. It was an offering, and whether it was accepted or rejected, it had been made. He walked out of the stable and into the cold morning air, his destination the saloon. The place was quiet now, the stench of the previous night's revelry hanging heavy and stale in the air. A single man was swamping the floors, his movements sluggish. Silas was in a small, cluttered office at the back, counting coins by the light of a kerosene lamp. He looked up as Elijah entered. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're up early, stranger," Silas said, his voice raspy. He made no move to be welcoming. Elijah didn't waste time with pleasantries. He took a worn leather pouch from his belt and placed it on the desk. The sound of the coins inside was a heavy, dull clink. "I'm here to settle the girl's debt. Clara Bell." Silas leaned back in his chair, a slow, greasy smile spreading across his face. He looked Elijah up and down, taking in the dusty clothes, the steady eyes, the lack of pretense. He saw a simple man, and simple men were easy to read. "Got a taste for the quiet ones, do you? I'll tell you. She's worth a pretty penny. Untouched. That one. Straight from the preacher's house to mine." He licked his lips, his gaze avaricious. "It'll cost you." "I'm not buying her," Elijah said, his voice flat and cold. "I'm paying the debt her father owed you, the one you hold her for. Tell me the amount." The saloon owner's smile faltered for a second. He was a man who understood transactions of the flesh, not of principle. This was an angle he hadn't considered. But money was money. He named a figure, an exorbitant sum that was likely 10 times the original debt. He watched Elijah's face for any sign of hesitation, ready to bargain. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply untied the leather pouch and began counting out coins onto the grimy surface of the desk. Gold eagles and silver dollars, worn smooth with years of travel. It was nearly everything he had in the world. Money he had saved for a future he no longer believed he would have. He counted it out with a steady hand, stacking the coins in neat piles. When he was done, the sum Silas had named was sitting on the desk. Silas stared at the money, his greed warring with his surprise. He scooped a few coins up, bit one, and then slowly, he nodded. "The debt is paid," he said, his eyes still fixed on the gold. "The girl is free to go." He saw it as a simple purchase, the transfer of property. The man's strange words meant nothing to him. Elijah turned and walked out of the office without another word. He did not ask to see Clara. He did not wait for thanks. The transaction was complete. He had done what he felt he must. Now, there was a long road ahead and a promise to a widow to keep. Clara was on her hands and knees scrubbing the saloon floor when one of the other girls, a hard-faced woman named May, nudged her roughly with her foot. "Silas wants to see you, in his office." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Clara's stomach. A summons to the office after a night like the last one could only mean one thing: another beating, or worse. She rose slowly, her body aching, and walked on trembling legs to the back room. She kept her eyes on the floor, bracing herself for the blow. "You're free to go," Silas said, not even bothering to look at her. He was still arranging his new coins into tall, satisfying stacks. Clara froze. The words made no sense. They were a language she didn't speak. "Sir?" "You heard me," he grunted, annoyed at the interruption. "Your debt's been paid. The stranger, the quiet one from last night, he paid it. Now get your things and get out. I don't run a charity." She stood there, rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. Free? It was a trick. It had to be a trick. Men like Silas didn't just let go of things they owned, and men like the quiet stranger didn't pay a fortune for nothing. It was a trade. She had been passed from one owner to another, like a horse or a sack of grain. A new kind of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through the fog of her fear. It was the anger of the utterly powerless, a desperate final rebellion. She didn't have any things to get. All she owned was the simple brown dress on her back. She turned and walked out of the office, her head held high. She strode through the saloon, past the staring girls and the swamp man, and pushed through the swinging doors into the bright morning sun. She saw him immediately. He was by his wagon, adjusting a harness, preparing to leave. She marched toward him, her fists clenched at her sides, her bare feet kicking up dust. He heard her coming and turned, his face calm and unreadable. "What do you think you've done?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a fury that surprised them both. Elijah looked at her, at the bruise on her cheek, the fierce light in her eyes. "I paid your debt." "My debt?" She spat the words. "You bought me. That's what you did. You think because you threw some coins at that pig in there, you have a right to me?" She took a step closer, her body trembling. "You can't buy a virgin soul." The words hung in the air between them, a desperate, defiant cry from the last unbreached corner of her being. His gaze did not waver. His expression softened, just slightly, and a deep, ancient sadness flickered in his eyes. He looked at this fierce, broken girl, and he saw not a possession, but a reflection of his own shattered world. His reply, when it came, was so soft she almost didn't hear it over the pounding of her own heart. "Then I'll give you mine." Clara stared at him, her anger faltering, replaced by a profound and dizzying confusion. The words were not what she had expected. They were not the words of a man claiming ownership. They were something else entirely, something she could not comprehend. She felt a sudden, terrifying urge to weep, to collapse at the feet of this strange, sad-eyed man. She fought it back, rebuilding her walls of anger and suspicion, stone by painful stone. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "No one gives away something for nothing in this world. What do you expect in return?" Elijah held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the terror behind her defiance, the desperate search for the trap she was sure was there. He gave a small, weary shake of his head. He turned away from her then, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if the conversation had cost him more energy than he had to spare. He walked to the front of his wagon and picked up the reins. "Freedom's not a bargain," he said, his back to her. "You don't owe me." With that, he clicked his tongue, and the horses strained, pulling the heavy wagon into motion. He didn't look back. He just started to move, a solitary figure heading out of the squalor of Sundown Ridge and into the vast, empty plains. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the dusty street, watching him go. The wagon wheels creaked, kicking up a cloud of dust that drifted back toward her. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run, to hide, to go anywhere but after him. He was a man, and men took things. That was the only truth she knew. But as she looked back at the swinging doors of the saloon, at the place where she had been a prisoner, she knew she could not stay. That was a slow death. This man, this stranger, was an unknown. He might be a different kind of monster, but he might also be something else. He had not touched her. He had not smiled when he looked at her. He had not spoken to her with the false sweetness of a predator. He had looked at her with a sorrow that matched her own. She made her choice. Her feet began to move, slowly at first, then faster. She began to run, her bare feet pounding on the hard-packed earth, chasing the dust cloud of his departing wagon. She did not call out. She just ran, leaving Sundown Ridge and whatever life it had offered behind her without a backward glance. The journey began in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape around them. Elijah heard her footsteps and pulled the wagon to a halt. He waited as she caught up, her chest heaving. He didn't speak, didn't ask why she had followed. He simply gestured with his head to the wagon seat. She hesitated for a moment, then climbed up, perching on the very edge of the wooden bench, as far from him as she could get. They traveled for hours. The sun climbed high in the sky, beating down on them. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the steady plod of the horses' hooves. Elijah kept his eyes on the horizon, his hands loose on the reins. He was acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the rigid set of her shoulders and the way she flinched if the wagon jostled her even an inch closer to him. He was careful to give her space, to create a buffer of air between them that was as solid and real as a wall. Clara sat in a state of wary vigilance. She watched him from the corner of her eye, studying his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins. She was waiting for the mask to drop, for the quiet stranger to reveal the brute she was sure lurked underneath. But he did nothing. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, didn't ask her a single question. When they stopped at midday to water the horses at a small creek, he handed her a piece of jerky and a canteen of water without a word, then walked away to check on the animals, leaving her to eat alone. Her curiosity began to gnaw at the edges of her fear. Who was this man? Why had he done what he did? His words echoed in her mind. "Then I'll give you mine." It was the strangest, most unsettling thing anyone had ever said to her. Late on the second day, the terrain began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper. And then, as they crested a low rise, she saw it, below them, nestled in a shallow valley, were the remains of a ranch, or what had once been a ranch. It was a scene of utter desolation. A cabin stood near a small creek, but its roof was gone, and its walls were blackened timbers, clawing at the sky like charred fingers. The barn beside it had collapsed in on itself, a heap of scorched wood and twisted metal. The corrals were broken, their fences burned to stumps. A lone stone chimney stood sentinel over the ruin, a monument to a life that had been violently erased. The place was a grave, haunted by the ghosts of what used to be. Elijah pulled the wagon to a stop. He sat for a long time, just looking down at the wreckage, And Clara saw a look of such profound and bottomless pain cross his face that she had to look away. This was not just a burned-down ranch. This was a wound. He finally clicked the reins and guided the horses down the gentle slope, stopping the wagon in what had once been the yard. He climbed down from the seat, his movements stiff. "This was my home," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all emotion. It was the first time he had volunteered a single piece of information about himself. He walked over to the burned cabin and reached out, his fingers brushing against a blackened log. "My wife, Sarah, my boy, Thomas, they were inside." He did not need to explain what had happened. The scorched earth told the story. "Rustlers. They wanted the cattle. We fought back. That night, they came back for revenge." Clara slid down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady. She looked at the ruin, at the lone chimney, at the silent, grieving man standing before it, and she finally understood. The hollow look in his eyes was not just sorrow. It was the reflection of this place. He was as ruined as his home. He stood there for another minute, lost in the ghosts of his past. Then, as if shaking himself from a dream, he turned away from the cabin. He went to the wagon and began unhitching the horses. When they were free, he led them to the creek to drink. Then he returned to the wagon and took out an axe. He walked to a small stand of pines at the edge of the property and, without a word, began to chop. The rhythmic thud of the axe striking wood was the only sound in the valley. He worked with a fierce, desperate energy, his body moving with a grim purpose. He was not just chopping wood. He was fighting back against the silence, against the ghosts, against the all-consuming grief that had defined his life for years. Clara stood by the wagon, feeling useless and out of place. She watched him for a while, a small, lost figure in the vast, empty landscape. He did not ask for her help. He did not seem to expect anything from her at all. He just worked, his focus absolute. A stubborn, defiant streak, the same one that had made her confront him in the street, began to stir within her. She had followed him. She had chosen this unknown path over the certain misery of her past. She would not be a passenger in this new life. Whatever it turned out to be, awkwardly at first, she began to help. She gathered the smaller, fallen branches and stacked them near the wagon. She found an old, scorched bucket by the creek and filled it with water for the horses. Her hands, soft and unused to labor, were clumsy. She snagged her dress on a branch and scraped her knuckles on a rock. But she didn't stop. She worked with a quiet, stubborn determination that mirrored his own. They worked until the sun began to sink below the western hills, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cool. Elijah stopped his chopping and used the wood he had cut to build a small, neat fire in the yard. He took a pot and some rations from the wagon and began to cook a simple meal of beans and bacon. They ate in their usual silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer the tense, wary silence of the road. It was a shared silence, filled with the crackle of the fire and the weight of the ruined home that surrounded them. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, Clara looked across the fire at Elijah. He was staring into the flames, but his thoughts were far away, back in a time when this yard had been filled with the sounds of a family, with the laughter of a wife and the shouts of a small boy. She finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you help people when the world didn't help you?" Elijah slowly raised his head, his gaze shifting from the fire to her face. The starlight softened the hard lines of his features, and for a moment, he looked younger, more vulnerable. He considered her question for a long time, the silence stretching out between them. He looked at the burned-down cabin, at the vast, empty prairie that surrounded them, at the endless, star-filled sky above. He thought of his wife, of his son, of all that he had lost. He thought of the cruelty he had seen in Sundown Ridge and the simple, desperate pride of the girl sitting across from him. His answer, when it finally came, was as simple and unadorned as the man himself. Because someone ought to. The days bled one into the next, marked not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun. The ruin of the ranch slowly, painstakingly, began to feel less like a graveyard and more like a beginning. Life, Clara discovered, was a series of relentless and practical tasks. It was the rhythm of hauling water from the creek, of mending what was broken, of coaxing a flame to life in the pre-dawn chill. She learned to cook over an open fire, a skill far removed from the tidy kitchen of her father's parsonage. At first, her biscuits were scorched on the bottom and raw in the middle, and the bacon was often a blackened crisp. Elijah never complained. He ate whatever she put before him with a quiet gratitude that made her want to try harder. Slowly, her cooking improved. She learned to judge the heat of the coals, to work with the simple ingredients they had, flour, salt, beans, and the occasional rabbit Elijah snared. He began the arduous task of rebuilding, starting with the barn. He worked with a silent, focused intensity that was both awesome and a little frightening to behold. He cleared the charred rubble, his muscles straining as he hauled away blackened timbers that had once held up a roof. He salvaged what wood he could and began felling new trees from the pine stand, squaring them into beams with his axe. Clara watched him, and then, tentatively, she began to help. She carried the smaller pieces of wood. She cleaned and sorted the old, square-headed nails that had survived the fire, straightening them one by one with a hammer. The work was hard, harder than anything she had ever known. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and calloused. The skin on her palms split and bled, but she would simply wrap them in strips of cloth and keep working. Aching muscles she never knew she had screamed in protest each morning. But with the pain came a new and unfamiliar strength. Her back, once perpetually hunched in a defensive crouch, began to straighten. Her arms grew lean and strong. She was being remade by the land, by the labor, by the simple act of building something where there had only been ashes. One afternoon, Elijah was trying to reset a corner post for a new corral. The post was heavy, and the ground was hard. He was struggling to hold it steady while tamping the earth around it, without a word. Clara came and put her shoulder to the post, adding her weight to his. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. They worked together, their movements falling into a shared, unspoken rhythm. In that moment, something shifted. She was no longer just the girl he had freed. She was a partner in this hard-scrabble life. He taught her to use a rifle. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away and handed her his heavy Winchester. It was heavier than she had expected, the wood smooth and cool against her cheek. "Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it," he said, his voice low and patient, standing a respectful distance behind her. "Breathe out slow and squeeze on the empty breath. Become still." Her first shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust a foot to the left of the can. The recoil slammed the butt of the rifle into her shoulder. A painful, jarring shock. She gasped and lowered the weapon, her shoulder throbbing. "Again," he said simply. She took a breath, lifted the rifle, and tried again and again. She missed every time, her frustration mounting. Her shoulder was a mess of blossoming bruises. Just as she was about to give up, to throw the heavy rifle down in disgust, she remembered his words. "Become still." She closed her eyes for a second, took a long, slow breath, and let it out. She opened her eyes, found the can in her sights, and as her lungs emptied, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, and this time, the tin can jumped into the air with a satisfying ping. A new, ragged hole punched clean through its middle. A slow, wide smile spread across Clara's face. It was the first real, unclouded smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a glimpse of the girl she might have been.
"I did it,"
she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I know," he said. He was looking at her, not the can. That smile became less of a stranger in the weeks that followed. It would appear when she successfully baked a loaf of bread that was cooked all the way through, or when one of the draft horses, a gentle giant named Ben, would nuzzle her hand looking for a treat. She was slowly, cautiously, letting life back in. And one day, he laughed. She had been trying to drive a nail into a fence rail, mimicking the easy, powerful swings she had seen him use. But she was clumsy, and on her third swing, she missed the nail head entirely and struck her own thumb with the hammer. She let out a sharp yelp, dropping the hammer and sticking her thumb in her mouth, her eyes watering. She looked over at him, expecting his usual stoic silence, but a strange sound came out of him. It started as a low rumble in his chest, then broke free. A short, sharp bark of sound. It was a laugh. It was rusty from disuse, rough around the edges, but it was unmistakably, genuinely, a laugh. The sound startled him as much as it did her. His eyes went wide for a second, and he clamped his mouth shut, as if trying to force the foreign sound back inside. Clara stared at him, her throbbing thumb forgotten. Then a small giggle escaped her, then another. Soon they were both laughing, standing in the middle of the half-built corral, the Wyoming sky a vast blue canvas above them. His laughter was quiet and hesitant. Hers was bright and free. It was the sound of ice breaking, of a long frozen river beginning to thaw. The sound echoed in the quiet valley, a small, defiant note of joy in a place that had only known sorrow. The trust between them grew not in grand pronouncements, but in these small, shared moments. It grew in the comfortable silence as they sat by the fire at night, in the way he would leave a canteen of fresh water for her where she was working, in the way she began to mend the tears in his shirts without being asked. They were two solitary people learning to orbit each other, their paths slowly, inevitably, drawing closer. The nights were the hardest. They slept in the open, on opposite sides of the fire, close enough for warmth, but far enough for propriety. But the darkness brought the nightmares. Sometimes she would wake to the sound of her own ragged breathing, the phantom feel of Jed's hand on her wrist, the memory of Silas's cold eyes. On other nights, it was he who would cry out, a single, anguished word torn from his sleep. "Sarah!" She would lie awake then, her heart aching for him, listening to the sound of his grief until he fell back into a troubled silence. One evening, the air was warm and smelled of pine and rain. A full moon hung in the sky, silvering the landscape and making the charred timbers of the cabin look like ancient bones. They had finished their meal, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Elijah was sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel a soothing sound in the quiet. Clara watched him, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, the intensity in his eyes. He was a good man, the thought came to her, simple and clear. In a world that had shown her only cruelty and weakness in men, he was decent and quiet and strong in a way that had nothing to do with brute force. He had given her freedom, and then, more importantly, he had given her the space to find her own strength. He had asked for nothing in return. A powerful, unfamiliar feeling was growing in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a mixture of gratitude and respect, and something more, something tender and new and terrifying. He finished with the axe, tested the blade with his thumb, and set it aside. He looked up and met her gaze across the embers. His eyes, usually so guarded, seemed softer in the firelight, acting on an impulse she did not fully understand. Clara stood up, walked around the fire, and knelt in front of him. He looked at her, his expression questioning, a hint of alarm in his eyes. Before he could speak, Before she could lose her nerve, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was not a passionate kiss. It was hesitant, clumsy, a simple, questing touch. His lips were chapped and tasted faintly of coffee and wood smoke. For a single, breathless moment, he was still, and then he pulled away. He didn't push her, didn't shove her. He simply drew back, his hands coming up to gently grip her shoulders, holding her at a distance. The rejection was a physical blow. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. She scrambled back, her cheeks burning. "I'm sorry," she stammered, looking at the ground. "I shouldn't have—" "Clara," he said, his voice rough. He let go of her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Is there something wrong with me?" He shook his head, his expression pained. "No, nothing is wrong with you." "Then why?" she insisted, her voice gaining a sharp, wounded edge. "Is it because of where you found me? Because of what I was? Do you think I am broken?" She threw the word at him like a stone, the word she feared most, the word she was sure he used to define her. "No," he said, and his voice was firm, absolute. He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw not pity, but a deep, agonizing sincerity. "I see you as healing, and that takes time." His words were meant to be kind, but to her, they were the cruelest kind of dismissal. He still saw her as a patient, a project, a wounded bird he was nursing back to health. He did not see her as a woman. The trust she had so carefully built crumbled into dust. The fragile warmth in her heart turned to ice. "I am not a broken thing for you to fix. Elijah," she said, her voice low and trembling with fury. "I am not your charity case. I am whole. I have been whole since the day I walked out of that town." "I never said you weren't," he said, his voice pleading. "Clara, listen to me." But she wouldn't listen. She was consumed by her own hurt and pride. "I would rather be in that saloon, scrubbing floors for that monster, than be here and be pitied by you." She jumped to her feet. "I am leaving." "Don't be foolish," he said, rising as well. "Where would you go?" "Back to town," she spat, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She had no intention of going back there, but she wanted to hurt him. "Maybe I will go back to Silas. At least he was honest about what he wanted from me." She turned and began to walk away from the fire, away from him, plunging into the moonlit darkness. "Clara!" he called after her. She didn't turn back. She just kept walking, her stride long and angry, following the faint wagon tracks that led away from the ranch. She walked for what felt like hours, fueled by a righteous, self-destructive anger. The moon climbed higher, and the landscape, which had begun to feel like home, now seemed alien and threatening. The shadows of the junipers looked like crouching men. The cry of a distant coyote made her jump. She was on a long, straight stretch of trail, a shallow canyon dropping off to one side. When she heard the sound of horses, she moved off the trail, her heart beginning to pound with a new kind of fear, her anger rapidly dissolving. Two riders appeared over a rise, silhouetted against the moon. They were riding hard. As they drew closer, a cold dread washed over her. She recognized one of them. It was Jed, the big trapper from the saloon. She tried to hide, to press herself into the shadows of some rocks. But it was too late. They had seen her. "Well, well," Jed's voice boomed in the quiet night. "Look what we have here. Silas's little songbird, flown a long way from her cage." The two men dismounted, their grins wide and cruel in the moonlight. They advanced on her slowly. "Silas wasn't too happy about you leaving," Jed said, his eyes roaming over her. "And he wasn't too happy about your friend. The quiet man, cost him a lot of money. That did—" Clara backed away, her foot slipping on the loose rock at the edge of the canyon. "Leave me alone." "Oh, we're not going to hurt you," the other man snickered. "We're just going to teach you a little lesson about property. And maybe teach your cowboy friend a lesson, 2. When he finds you. They were on her then, a blur of rough hands and cruel laughter. She fought back, kicking and scratching with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. But she was no match for the two of them. A fist connected with her jaw, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. She fell to the ground, the rocks tearing at her skin. The last thing she heard was their mocking laughter as they rode away, leaving her in the dust. When she came to, the sky was a bruised purple, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the canyon. Every part of her body was a symphony of agony. She tried to move, but a wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her. She was alone and broken, and a cold rain had begun to fall. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness claim her again. Elijah found her tracks an hour after she had left. He knew it was pride and foolishness that drove her, but a cold knot of fear was tightening in his gut. He saddled Stout and set off, following her clear trail in the moonlight. When he saw the tracks of the two other horses joining hers, his fear turned to ice. He spurred his horse into a gallop. He found her at the bottom of the canyon, a small, still heap in the pouring rain. He leaped from his horse, his heart a cold, dead weight in his chest. He knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her face. She was pale and still, her face swollen and bruised, a trickle of blood running from a cut on her temple. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, he thought she was dead. Then he saw the faint, shallow flutter of her breath. A sound escaped his lips, a raw, ragged sound of anguish and fury. He gathered her into his arms as gently as he could. She was so light, so fragile. He carried her to his horse and mounted, settling her limp body in front of him. He wrapped his coat around her, trying to shield her from the driving rain, and turned for home. The storm broke then in all its fury, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling across the plains. He rode through it, his face a mask of grim determination, whispering her name over and over again into the wind, a prayer against the raging dark. He carried her into the half-finished barn, the only place with a solid roof, and laid her on a thick bed of fresh hay. He lit a lantern and built a fire, his movements swift and sure. He stripped off her wet, torn dress and covered her with every blanket he owned. He fetched water and clean cloths and began, with an agonizing gentleness, to tend to her wounds. He cleaned the cuts on her face, his touch as soft as a whisper. He washed the blood from her hair. He worked in silence, his entire being focused on this one desperate task. Sometime near dawn, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. She looked at him, at his face haggard with worry, at his hands carefully bandaging her arm. She saw the silent, desperate devotion in his every move, and she began to cry. They were not the choked, muffled sobs he had heard in the stable. These were quiet, streaming tears that rolled down her bruised cheeks and into her hair. They were not tears of pain, or of fear, or of anger. She was crying for a reason she could not have put into words. She was crying because in the face of all the world's cruelty, in the wreckage of her life and his, a single, impossible truth was dawning. She was not a possession to be bought or a broken thing to be fixed. In the eyes of this sad, quiet man, she was something precious. She might actually be loved. Time dissolved into a feverish haze for days. Clara drifted in a twilight world of pain and disjointed memories, anchored to consciousness only by the steady, quiet presence of Elijah. He was a constant shadow in the lantern-lit barn, a guardian who never seemed to sleep. He kept a low fire burning, its warmth a gentle comfort against the persistent chill that had settled deep in her bones. He spooned thin, warm broth between her lips, a task he performed with a reverence that was almost holy. He bathed her brow with cool cloths, his touch infinitely gentle on her bruised skin. His devotion was a silent vigil. He did not speak words of comfort. His comfort was in his presence, his unwavering attention. He moved about the barn with a quiet economy, mending harnesses and cleaning his rifle. But his gaze would return to her every few moments. His eyes clouded with a worry so profound it was a physical weight in the small space. It was more than care. It was a penance, a prayer, a quiet, desperate bargain with a God he no longer trusted. He was watching over her as if her flickering life was the last candle in a world consumed by darkness, and he would give his own breath to keep it from going out. The fever broke on the 4th day. Clara woke to a world that was sharp and clear and agonizingly real. The pain was no longer a dull, distant fog, but a series of sharp, specific aches in her bones and her flesh. The memory of the attack, which had been mercifully blurred, returned with horrifying clarity. She remembered the cruel grins, the rough hands, the searing pain, and the final, crushing humiliation. She lay on the bed of hay, covered in his blankets, and a despair colder and deeper than any fever settled over her. Elijah was by her side in an instant, a tin cup of water in his hand. He knelt and held it to her lips. She drank, the cool liquid a small relief. He watched her, his face haggard, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than before. She turned her face away from him, looking at the rough-hewn wall of the barn. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dry, broken whisper. "You should have left me." "Don't talk like that," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It's true," she insisted, the words tasting like poison. "I wish you had left me in that canyon. I wish I had died there." The words were born of a shame so deep it felt like it was dissolving her from the inside out. She had brought this violence to his door. She was a harbinger of ruin, just like the fire that had taken his family. Elijah was silent for a long moment. She expected him to offer a platitude, to tell her she didn't mean it. Instead, when he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything but a raw, hollow truth that sent a shiver through her. "Then I would have died too." She turned her head slowly and looked at him. There was no sentimentality in his eyes, no dramatic flourish. He was stating a fact, a terrible and profound equation that now governed his existence. Her life was tied to his. Her death would be his own. The finality in his voice silenced her. In that moment, the last of her defenses, the pride and the anger that had sent her running into the night, washed away, leaving her utterly exposed. The line between them, already blurred, now seemed to vanish entirely. That night, he moved his bedroll from its place by the barn door to the empty space beside her pallet of hay. It was not a proposition. It was a statement. He would not leave her side. They began to sleep in the same room, a few feet of hay-strewn earth separating them. They did not touch. They rarely spoke after the lantern was extinguished. They simply existed in the shared darkness, breathing the same night air, his steady presence a shield against her nightmares, and her soft, healing breaths a balm for his ancient grief. As her body began to mend, a new kind of intimacy grew in the quiet spaces between them. She would watch him work, his hands, so gentle with her, now strong and capable as he repaired a broken wagon wheel. He would bring her a small wildflower he had found by the creek, leaving it in a cup of water beside her bed without a word. One evening, as the shadows grew long, she felt strong enough to sit up, her back braced against a pile of hay. He sat nearby, cleaning his pistols, the metallic click and slide of the mechanisms a precise and comforting sound.
"Elijah,"
she said softly. He stopped his work and looked at her. "Tell me about her," she said. "Your wife." He set the pistol down carefully on a clean cloth. He did not seem surprised by the question. He stared at a point on the far wall, his eyes looking back through the years. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice gentle. "She was a good woman, kind. Her father owned the ranch next to my father's. We grew up together. It was always just understood that we would marry, and so we did." He paused, choosing his words with care. It was a good life, a simple life. We built this place together. She was strong, stronger than me in some ways. She knew the land. He fell silent, and Clara waited. She could feel the careful edifice he was building around his memories, the walls he had constructed to contain the pain.
Did you love her?
She asked, the question so quiet it was almost lost in the vastness of the barn. Elijah's gaze finally shifted and met hers. His eyes were filled with a complex sorrow. I cared for her, deeply. I respected her. I would have died for her, and for our boy. He took a breath, and the next words seemed to be torn from a place deep inside him, a place he had never shown to another living soul.
But it was a life we agreed to, a partnership. It wasn't this.
He gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the barn, at the shared air, at the unspoken thing that was growing there. I never felt like my own soul was tied to hers. I never felt this ache, this feeling that if you were to disappear, the whole world would go silent. I never loved her the way I feel something growing for you now. The confession hung in the air, vast and terrifying. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was shocked, not by his admission, but by the raw, painful honesty of it. She thought of his silent vigil, of his words by her bedside. She thought of the way he looked at her when he thought she was sleeping.
"You think you love me?"
she whispered, the words trembling with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He gave a short, harsh shake of his head, as if to clear it. He looked directly at her, and the carefully constructed walls of his composure seemed to crumble, leaving him as exposed as she felt. "I don't think," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I know, and I'm terrified." He was terrified. The word resonated with her own fear. To be loved like this, with this intensity, was as frightening as it was beautiful. It was a weight, a responsibility, a bond forged in fire and blood. He rose and came to her, kneeling beside her in the hay. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but as if to prove to himself that she was real. His hand was shaking, slowly, hesitantly. He lifted it and cupped her jaw, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek. So gently it was like the brush of a bird's wing. He was looking at her as if he were memorizing her face, as if he were seeing her for the first time and the last. He leaned in, and this time, she did not pull away. This time, there was no pride, no anger, no fear of being seen as broken. There was only this man, and his terrifying, beautiful love. Their first kiss was not passionate. It was a meeting of two solitudes, a trembling, raw and hesitant press of lips. It tasted of salt and sorrow and a fragile, burgeoning hope. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer, all in one silent, breathless moment. It was the confirmation of everything that had passed between them, unspoken. When he pulled away, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her own cheek. And then she wept. She wept for the girl she had been, for the pain she had endured, for the impossible, unlooked-for grace of this moment. Elijah said nothing. He simply stood, turned, and walked out of the barn into the gathering twilight, leaving her with the lingering taste of their shared grief and nascent love. He went to the half-finished corral and leaned his forehead against a rough wooden post. And there, alone, with the vast, indifferent sky as his only witness, he let his own tears fall. He wept for the wife he had respected but not loved, for the son he had adored, and for the terrifying, overwhelming wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. To love again was to invite the possibility of loss again, and the thought was a knife in his soul. Word travels in the West, carried on the wind from one dusty outpost to the next. The story of the quiet cowboy who had paid a fortune to free the preacher's girl from Silas's saloon became a whisper, then a tale told over campfires and poker games. It was embellished. Of course, some said he had won her in a card game. Others said he had killed 3 men to get her. But the core of the story remained. A girl Silas considered his property was gone, and the saloon owner had been made to look like a fool. For a man like Silas, whose power was built on a foundation of fear and intimidation, this was an insult that could not be borne. It wasn't about the girl, it was about the principle. He sent 2 men out, not Jed and his partner, who had not been seen since that night, but 2 new men, harder and meaner, with dead eyes and guns worn low on their hips. Their instructions were simple. Go to the burned-out ranch, bring back the girl, and leave the cowboy in the dirt as a message to anyone else who might think of defying him. Elijah saw them coming a day before they arrived. Not the men themselves, but the signs. A lone rider watching the valley from a distant ridge, disappearing when he was spotted. A feeling in the air, a prickling on the back of his neck that told him the peace they had found was about to be shattered. He did not tell Clara what he suspected. He did not want to frighten her, but his actions spoke for him. The work on the barn stopped. He began, with a cold, methodical purpose, to fortify the cabin. He had already rebuilt 1 wall and framed a roof. Now he worked to finish the other walls, using the heaviest logs he could manage, leaving only small, narrow slits for windows, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. He dragged fallen timbers and rocks to create a low barricade in front of the single door. Clara watched him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "What is it?" she finally asked, her voice steady.
What's happening?
He stopped his work and looked at her. Her bruises had faded to pale yellow shadows. The cuts had healed. There was a new strength in her eyes, a resilience he had helped put there. He would not lie to her. "Trouble's coming," he said simply. "From town." She didn't need to ask for details. She knew. A cold fear washed over her, but it was followed by a hot, fierce surge of anger. They had tried to take everything from her. Her freedom, her dignity, her life. She would not let them take this. That evening, as the sun set, Elijah laid out his weapons on a blanket, the Winchester rifle, 2 Colt revolvers, and a long, heavy hunting knife. He cleaned and oiled each one with a practiced, lethal grace. Clara came and stood beside him. "You taught me how to shoot," she said. It was not a question. He looked up at her, ready to argue, ready to tell her to hide, to run if she could. But he saw the look on her face. It was the same stubborn, defiant pride he had seen in her on that first night in the stable. But now it was forged into something harder, something unbreakable.
"This is my home now,"
she said, her voice low and fierce.
"They are not taking it from me. They are not taking you from me."
He saw that it was useless to argue. To send her away would be to deny the very strength he had come to love in her. He simply nodded and picked up the rifle he had been cleaning. He handed it to her. But first, their hands brushed as she took it, and in that small touch, an unspoken pact was sealed. They would face the coming darkness together. The wind came first, a low moan across the plains that grew into a desolate howl, rattling the new timbers of the half-built cabin. It was a wild, lonely sound, the voice of the empty land itself, and it scoured the darkness, carrying with it the chill of the high country. Inside the small, fortified structure, the air was thick with tension. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into a landscape of shifting unknowns. Elijah sat on a low crate, his back against the solid log wall. His Winchester rested across his lap, its metal cool and solid beneath his hands. Before him, on a blanket, lay his 2 revolvers, fully loaded, and the long hunting knife, its blade catching the lamplight with a predatory gleam. He was preternaturally still, a man who had made a home in the dangerous quiet between one breath and the next. He wasn't just waiting, he was listening with his entire being, to the wind, to the creak of the wood, to the frantic, terrified beating of his own heart, a heart he had thought incapable of such feeling. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. Clara sat on her pallet of hay in the far corner. The rifle Elijah had given her held tightly in her hands. She had checked the load 3 times, her fingers clumsy but sure. Fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but it was a different fear than she had ever known. It was not the passive, helpless terror of the saloon, nor the panicked dread of the canyon. This fear was sharp and alive, a whetstone against which her resolve was being honed. She looked at Elijah, at his calm, grim profile illuminated by the lantern, and she drew strength from his stillness. He had built these walls to protect her. She would not let them be breached without a fight. Hours passed. The moon, a pale, scarred coin, rose and was promptly swallowed by thick, racing clouds. The world outside was a maelstrom of wind and impenetrable blackness. Then, through the howl of the wind, came a new sound. It was faint at first, then clearer, the rhythmic, determined beat of horses' hooves. Elijah's head came up. His eyes met Clara's across the small room. He didn't speak. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. This was it. She scrambled from her pallet and took her position beside one of the narrow slits he had cut into the wall, her rifle poking through. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure the men outside could hear it. Elijah moved to the slit on the other side of the door, one of the heavy revolvers now in his hand. They appeared out of the darkness like demons, 3 riders carrying blazing pitch pine torches. The flames streamed in the wind, casting a wild, hellish light on their faces and throwing monstrous, leaping shadows against the barn and the scorched remains of the old cabin. They were not just here to reclaim property. They were here to burn, to destroy, to salt the earth of this small patch of hope Elijah and Clara had begun to cultivate. They reined in their horses 20 yards from the cabin, forming a loose semicircle. One of them, a big man with a thick beard, cupped a hand to his mouth and shouted, his voice nearly torn away by the wind. "Cowboy, we know you're in there. Silas wants his property back. Send out the girl, and we might just let you live." Elijah's voice, when he answered, was as cold and steady as a block of ice. "There's no property here for you. Turn your horses and ride away, and you'll see the sunrise." A coarse laugh answered him. "We'll see the sunrise over the ashes of this place." The big man raised his rifle. A flash of orange split the night, and a bullet slammed into the log wall a foot from Elijah's head, sending splinters flying. The battle had begun. Elijah fired back, the revolver bucking in his hand. The shot was aimed not at the man, but at his torch. The pitch pine brand flew from the man's hand and landed in the dirt, sputtering in the wind. At the same moment, Clara fired the Winchester. The rifle's report was a deafening crack inside the small cabin. Her shot went high, whistling over the riders' heads. But it served its purpose. It told them there were 2 guns inside, not one. The men scattered, dismounting and taking cover behind the low stone barricade and the corners of the barn. The night erupted into a chaos of noise and flashing light. Gunshots answered gunshots. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls. The men's shouts were angry and guttural, lost in the shriek of the wind. They began to advance on foot, moving from shadow to shadow, their remaining torches casting a disorienting, flickering light on the scene. Elijah was a study in lethal efficiency. He fired, reloaded, and fired again, his movement stripped of all hesitation. He was not a man who enjoyed violence, but he was a man who understood it intimately. He knew that the only way to survive it was to be more resolute, more implacable, than the men who brought it to your door. Clara's hands were shaking, but she did not stop. She worked the lever action of the rifle, ejected the spent cartridge, and chambered a new one. She fired through the slit, aiming at the flashes of their guns, the dark shapes that darted through the night. She was no longer the preacher's daughter. She was no longer Silas's property. She was a woman defending her home. One of the men made a dash for the cabin, a torch held high, his clear intent to set the new roof ablaze. Elijah's revolver barked twice. The man stumbled, cried out, and fell, his torch rolling away to be extinguished by the wind-driven dust. "One down," Elijah said, his voice a low growl. But the other two were close now, using the blind spots near the door. A heavy weight suddenly slammed against the cabin's single, heavy door. They were trying to break it down. "Get away from the door!" Elijah yelled to Clara. He holstered his revolver and grabbed the heavy hunting knife from the blanket. The door shuddered again under a heavy blow, the wood groaning. A third blow, and the bar he had set across it splintered, the door flying open to reveal the dark, howling night and the silhouette of a man lunging through. Elijah met him, not with a gun, but with his body. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and desperate, grunting force. The man was strong, reeking of whiskey and rage. His hand clawed at Elijah's face while the other fumbled for the pistol at his belt. Elijah brought the handle of his knife down hard on the man's wrist, and the man howled in pain. As they wrestled on the floor, the third attacker, the big bearded man, appeared in the doorway, his rifle leveled. Clara screamed a warning. Elijah looked up and saw the dark circle of the rifle barrel pointed at his chest. He tried to roll, to move, but he was entangled with the man beneath him. There was a flash, a deafening roar. An immense, searing force slammed into Elijah's left shoulder. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer and a branding iron at the same time. His arm went numb, a useless weight. A wave of blackness threatened to pull him under. He fought it, his vision swimming. The man on the floor beneath him took the opportunity, driving his head hard into Elijah's chin. The world tilted, through the roaring in his ears. Elijah saw the big man stepping into the cabin to finish the job. He saw Clara, her face a pale mask of terror in the dim light. And then he saw her move. She had dropped the rifle. It was too long, too clumsy for a fight this close. In her hand was the other revolver he had left on the blanket. She raised it with both hands, her arms shaking violently. She fired. The shot went wild, embedding itself in the doorframe. The big man laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. He took another step toward her, raising his rifle. He never saw the other man, the one who had been wrestling with Elijah, staggered to his feet. He came up behind Clara, his face a mask of pain and fury, his hand reaching for her. Clara saw him. There was no time to reload, no time to think. She acted on pure, primal instinct. She dropped the useless revolver and snatched the long, heavy hunting knife from Elijah's belt, where he had tucked it. The man grabbed her arm, his fingers like iron bands. He spun her around, his foul breath hot on her face. "Little witch!" he snarled. And in that moment, she lunged forward, putting all of her weight, all of her fear, and all of her rage into a single, desperate thrust. The blade slid between his ribs with a sickening, wet sound. The man's eyes went wide with shock. A soft, surprised grunt escaped his lips. His grip on her arm slackened. He looked down at the handle of the knife protruding from his chest, then back at her face, his expression one of pure disbelief. He took one staggering step back and then collapsed, a dead weight on the cabin floor. The big man stared, his cruel laugh frozen on his face. He had been so focused on Elijah that he had failed to see the immediate threat. That moment of hesitation cost him. Elijah, fighting through a wave of agony, had drawn his other revolver. He fired from the floor. The bullet caught the big man in the leg. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise, and stumbled backward out of the doorway, disappearing into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the howl of the wind and the ragged, desperate sound of their own breathing. A moment later, they heard the frantic sound of a horse galloping away, fading into the storm. He had escaped. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the narrow windows when Clara finally moved. She was still standing over the body of the man she had killed, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The lantern had been knocked over in the fight, but its flame still flickered. casting a gruesome light on the scene. The cabin was a wreck of overturned crates and spilled supplies. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She looked at Elijah. He was slumped against the wall, his face as pale as ash, his left shoulder a dark, saturated mess of blood. He was trying to push himself up with his good arm, his jaw clenched against the pain. The sight of him, so vulnerable, so broken, snapped her out of her shock. She rushed to his side.
"Elijah,"
she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm all right," he grunted, the words a clear lie. "You are not," she said, her voice firming. She helped him to his feet, and he leaned on her, his weight a heavy, solid burden. She guided him to her pallet of hay and gently helped him lie down. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely untie the knot on the water skin. But she managed. She found clean cloths, the ones he had used to tend to her wounds just days before. With a small, sharp knife, she cut away the sleeve of his bloody shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole in the thick muscle of his shoulder where the bullet had torn through. It was bleeding sluggishly. She cleaned it as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle, her movements becoming more sure as she focused on the task. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain, but filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made her heart ache. He had always been the strong one, the protector. Now, he was the one in need of care, and he was letting her in, letting her see him at his weakest. She packed the wound with clean cloth and began to bind it tightly with long strips she tore from a clean shirt. He winced as she pulled the bandage tight, but he did not make a sound. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands and arms smeared with his blood. The first rays of the morning sun streamed through the open doorway, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The ranch was safe, but the ground outside was scorched from a fallen torch, and the door to their small sanctuary hung broken on its hinges. He reached out his good hand and touched her cheek. His fingers were trembling slightly. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. "You're not mine," he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and something else, something deeper. "But I'm yours." The words were a vow, a surrender, a declaration that went far beyond love. It was an admission of a bond that had been forged in shared suffering and sealed in violence. She was not his possession, but he, in his entirety, his soul, his grief, his future, belonged to her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek and fell onto his hand. In the days that followed, a new rhythm was established. The world shrank to the size of the small valley. The first task was the grimmest. Together, they dragged the two bodies to the far side of the creek and buried them in deep, unmarked graves. Clara worked beside Elijah, her face set, her movements deliberate. She did not speak of the man she had killed, but the memory was a constant shadow in her eyes. After the graves were filled, they rebuilt the broken section of the corral fence, the simple, honest labor a balm to their frayed nerves. A profound change had taken place between them. The last vestiges of fear and hesitation were gone. That night, she moved her pallet of hay next to his. They lay side by side in the darkness, not touching, but with their shoulders almost brushing. There was no fear, only a deep, abiding comfort in each other's presence. They were two parts of a whole, and the space between them was no longer an empty void, but a quiet, sacred space that belonged only to them. Something permanent and unbreakable had formed in the crucible of that violent night. A week later, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. He was not a threat, but the law. A sheriff, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and a silver star pinned to his dusty vest, rode into the yard. He had heard rumors of the trouble, of Silas's missing men. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the fortified cabin, the broken door, the fresh mounds of earth across the creek. He looked at Elijah, at his arm in a sling, and his expression hardened. "I'm Sheriff Miller," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've come to ask about 2 men who went missing from Sundown Ridge. I have reason to believe they were heading this way." Elijah stood before him, calm and resigned. "They came here," he said simply. "They're buried across the creek." The sheriff's eyes narrowed.
You're admitting to killing them?
"I'm admitting to defending my home," Elijah said. The sheriff's hand rested on the butt of his pistol. He looked from Elijah to the graves and back again. The story looked simple enough. A drifter, a girl of questionable reputation, 2 dead men. It was the kind of thing that ended with a rope. "You're going to have to come with me. Son, we'll sort this out in town." "No," a clear, firm voice said. Both men turned. Clara had stepped out of the cabin. She was no longer the frightened girl the sheriff might have heard about in rumors. Her stance was straight. Her chin was high, and her eyes were clear and direct. She walked to stand beside Elijah, a silent, unshakable ally. "Those men were sent here by Silas Black, the owner of the saloon in Sundown Ridge," she said, her voice ringing with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "They came here to drag me back to a life of servitude I was sold into, and to kill the man who freed me." She proceeded to tell him everything. She told him about her father's debt, about being sold to Silas, about the brutal conditions in the saloon. She told him about the first 2 men who had attacked her in the canyon, and about the night attack on the ranch. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply stated the facts, her voice a testament to the truth. Sheriff Miller listened, his expression slowly changing from suspicion to a weary kind of empathy. He had been a lawman in this territory for 20 years. He knew men like Silas Black. He had seen countless girls with the same haunted look that he now saw in Clara's eyes, but he had rarely seen one speak with such unshakable conviction. He looked at her quiet strength, and then at Elijah, who stood silently beside her, letting her fight this battle with her own words. He saw not a killer in his maul, but 2 decent people trying to survive in a world that was anything but. When she was finished, the sheriff was silent for a long time. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "He sent men after you before this?" he asked softly. Clara nodded. "They left me for dead in a canyon 2 miles from here. Elijah found me." The sheriff let out a long breath and put his hat back on. He looked at the graves again, and then at the broken door of the cabin. He had enough. "I will take your statement," he said, pulling a small notebook and a pencil from his pocket. He turned to Elijah. "I suspect my investigation in Sundown Ridge will find that Silas's 2 men simply rode off and were never seen again. These things happen out here." He looked Clara in the eye. "Thank you for your courage, Miss." He took her formal statement, tipped his hat, and rode away, a promise of justice, however rough, following in his wake. In the days after the sheriff's visit, a semblance of peace returned to the valley, but a new shadow had fallen over Elijah. He grew quiet again, distant. Clara would find him staring out at the plains, his face a mask of old grief. He was healed enough to work again, but he did so with a grim, solitary focus. One evening, she found him by the wagon, packing his saddlebags with jerky and a few supplies. A cold dread seized her heart. "What are you doing?" she asked. He didn't turn to face her. "I'm leaving, Clara." "Leaving?" The word was a choked whisper. "Why?" He finally turned, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it was like a physical blow. "Because I bring this with me," he said, his voice low and hoarse. He gestured at his bandaged shoulder, at the broken door, at the whole valley. "Trouble follows me. It always has. The fire that took my family. This attack. It's me. I stay here, and sooner or later, more men will come. Silas won't let this go. I'm putting you in danger every day I remain." "I am not in danger," she said fiercely. "I am safe when I am with you." "You're not," he insisted, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you. Clara, I can't go through that again. The only way to keep you safe is for me to leave. It was the logic of a man so deeply scarred by loss that he would cut off his own heart to ensure it could not be broken again. He was reverting to his old life, the solitary wanderer, protecting others by keeping his distance. He turned to finish his packing. He was resolved. He would leave at dawn. "No," she said. He stopped, his back to her. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "Clara, don't make this harder." "You do not understand," she interrupted. She walked to a small wooden box inside the cabin where she kept the few things she now considered her own. She took out a folded piece of paper. She walked back to him and held it out. He looked at her, confused, and then down at the paper. It was a deed, a legal document he had insisted on drawing up with the sheriff. A piece of paper that formally transferred the ownership of the burned-out ranch, and all the acres that came with it, to one Clara Bell. He had done it to ensure that, no matter what happened to him, she would have a place. Something that was legally hers. Something no one could take from her. He had meant it as a shield for her. He had never imagined she would use it as an anchor for him. "This is my ranch, Elijah Brooks," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "The deed is in my name. You are on my property, and I am not asking you to leave." He stared at the paper, then at her face, at the fierce, loving, defiant woman who stood before him. He had tried to give her freedom, and she was using it to bind him to her. He had tried to give her a home, and she was refusing to let him be homeless. A slow, shuddering breath escaped his lips. The weight of his past, the fear of the future, it all seemed to recede in the face of her simple, unshakable declaration. He was hers, and this was their home. Together. The seasons turned, each painting the valley in a new palette. Summer burned the grasses to a pale gold, and the air shimmered with a heat that made the distant mountains waver like a dream. Autumn followed, crisp and cool, setting the cottonwoods along the creek ablaze in fiery yellows. Winter came quietly, draping the world in a thick, sound-dampening blanket of white. And then, impossibly, spring returned, and the land, which had seemed so dead and barren, exploded with the tender green of new life. With the turning of the seasons, the ranch was reborn. The crude, fortified cabin slowly transformed into a proper home. A new roof of hand-split cedar shakes kept out the rain and snow. Glass panes, purchased on a rare trip to a respectable town 30 miles east, were set into the windows, letting in the light. The barn, once a heap of charred rubble, now stood tall and sturdy, its new wood already beginning to weather to a soft silver gray. But the most miraculous transformation was the small patch of earth Clara had claimed as her own. She had turned the soil with a shovel, her back straining, her hands raw, picking out the rocks one by one. She had planted seeds saved from their supplies and tended the plot with a fierce, maternal devotion, and the stubborn earth had yielded. Green shoots of beans and squash pushed their way toward the sun, a defiant splash of life against the vast, wild landscape. It was more than a garden. It was a testament. It was proof that something beautiful could be coaxed to grow in a place that had known only ashes. Clara herself had blossomed with the land. The sun had browned her skin and bleached her hair to a pale gold. The hard work had given her a lean, resilient strength and a sureness in her movements. The haunted, hollow look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, steady gaze that saw the world exactly as it was and was not afraid. She had found a quiet confidence that came not from pride, but from a deep, unshakable knowledge of her own capabilities. She could mend a fence, cook a meal over an open fire, and handle a rifle with a calm competence that was second nature. Her transformation did not go unnoticed. The story of what had happened at the ranch, confirmed by Sheriff Miller's subsequent and thorough investigation that had resulted in Silas Black quietly selling his saloon and disappearing from the territory, had become a legend of sorts. It was a story whispered among the downtrodden and the desperate, a small flicker of hope in a dark world. One day, a girl appeared at the edge of the valley. She was no more than 16, with terrified eyes and the telltale bruises of a hard life. She had run away from a similar establishment in a town even more lawless than Sundown Ridge and had walked for 3 days, drawn by the rumor of a safe haven. Clara took her in without question. She did not coddle the girl or offer pity. Instead, she gave her a plate of warm food, a bed in the barn, and, the next morning, a hoe to work in the garden. She taught the girl how to be strong, how to be self-sufficient, just as she had learned. 2 more girls followed in the coming months. The ranch became a quiet, informal sanctuary, a place where broken wings could be mended, not by charity, but by the healing power of honest work and shared understanding. Clara became a quiet leader, an embodiment of the survival she now championed. Elijah watched her, and his heart was a constant, aching mix of awe and a deep, abiding love. He had freed one woman, and she, in turn, was creating a legacy of freedom all her own. He worked beside her, his silence no longer one of grief, but of a deep and contented peace he had never thought to know again. He was building more than a ranch. He was building a life, a real one, tangible and solid beneath his hands. But the ghosts of his past had not been banished entirely. They still came for him in the deep of the night, in the vulnerable hours before dawn. The nightmares were always the same. He was surrounded by fire, the heat scorching his skin, the air thick with smoke that choked the breath from his lungs. He could hear Sarah screaming his name, and the high, thin cry of his son, Thomas. He would run toward the sounds, but his legs were like lead, and the flames would always rise up like a wall, separating him from them, forcing him to watch, helpless, as the sounds faded into the roar of the fire. He would wake with a strangled cry, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the smell of smoke so real in his nostrils it made him gag. In the early days, Clara had pretended to be asleep, her heart breaking for him, knowing that this was a grief too sacred for her to intrude upon. But as the months passed and the bond between them deepened into an unspoken marriage of souls, she could no longer lie still and listen to his torment. One night, his cry was sharper than usual, a raw sound of pure agony. She rose from her pallet and went to him. He was thrashing in his sleep, his hands clenched into fists. She knelt beside him and gently, cautiously, placed her hand on his uninjured shoulder.
"Elijah,"
she whispered.
"wake up, you're dreaming."
His eyes flew open, wide and wild with the horror of the dream. He stared at her for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his gaze unfocused, still seeing the flames.
"It's all right,"
she said, her voice soft and steady.
"It's over. You're here. You're safe."
He blinked, and the fire in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by the familiar, deep sadness. He looked at her hand on his shoulder, and then at her face, her features etched with concern in the pale moonlight. He reached up with his good hand and covered hers, his grip tight, anchoring himself to her, to the present. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She stayed there, kneeling beside him, until his breathing slowed and the shudders racking his body ceased. From that night on, whenever the nightmares came, she would be there to gently call him back from the ashes. Late that spring, Sheriff Miller paid them another visit. He was on his way back from the new settlement of Harmony Creek, a town that was trying to build itself on a foundation of families and law, rather than whiskey and greed. He sat with them by the creek, drinking coffee, and spoke of the town's progress. They had built a schoolhouse, he said, but they had no one to teach the children. He looked directly at Clara. "I told them about you," he said, "about your father being a preacher, about your courage, a woman of your character. You would be a godsend to them. They're prepared to offer you a proper salary, a small house to live in, a respectable life." The offer hung in the air, glittering and impossibly tempting. A respectable life. A life where she would be known not as the girl from the saloon, but as Miss Bell, the schoolteacher. A life without the constant, back-breaking labor of the ranch, without the ever-present threat of violence that clung to the wild places. A life that was safe and normal and clean. It was everything she might have once dreamed of. She saw Elijah's face. A shudder had come down over his eyes, his expression carefully neutral, but she saw the flicker of fear in their depths, the primal terror of the man who had already lost everything once.
I will have to think about it,
she said, her voice barely a whisper. For the next few days, she was quiet, withdrawn. She moved through her chores with a distracted air, her thoughts a world away. She weighed the two lives in the balance, the teacher in Harmony Creek, respected and safe, living in a proper house with a lace-curtained window, and the woman of the ranch, her hands calloused, her face browned by the sun, living in a cabin she had helped build from the ground up, her only companion a silent, grieving man who held her soul in his hands. Elijah gave her space. He did not press her. He did not remind her of all they had built together. He did not speak of the yawning, black abyss that would open in his life if she were to leave. He simply watched her, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, and prepared himself for the pain he was sure was coming. On the third evening, as she stood on the small rise overlooking the valley, he came and stood beside her. The setting sun had painted the sky in strokes of rose and gold, and the ranch below looked peaceful, idyllic, a small island of order in the vast, untamed wilderness. "You don't have to decide right away," he said, his voice quiet. "I know," she replied. He took a breath, and she could feel the effort it cost him to say what he said next. "If you choose to go, Clara, I will understand. It's a good life they're offering. A safe life. It's what you deserve." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with an emotion he could not hide. He was not giving her permission. He was giving her back the one thing he valued above all else, the one thing he had fought to give her from the very beginning, her freedom. "Whatever you choose," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I want you to know that I'll still be here, for as long as this ranch stands, soul and all." It was the most profound declaration of love he could have made. It was a love without ownership, without expectation, without demand. It was a love that was content to simply exist for her, whether she was near or far. Clara turned and looked at him, at his strong, sad face, at the unwavering loyalty in his eyes. And in that moment, her choice became clear, as simple and true as the bedrock beneath their feet. She had thought the choice was between a life of safety and a life of struggle, but she saw now that was not the choice at all. Harmony Creek offered respectability, but it was a life defined by others. The ranch, this hard, beautiful, unforgiving piece of land, was the only place on earth she had ever felt truly free. It was the place where she had shed the skin of the victim and discovered the woman she was meant to be. It was not a place of struggle. It was the source of her strength. "I'm not going," she said softly. He turned to her, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning hope. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. "I'm staying, Elijah, not because I feel like I owe you anything, not because I'm afraid to be alone. I'm staying because this is my home. It's the place where I found myself." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky deepened to a bruised purple, ablaze with the first stars. The air grew cool and smelled of dust and pine. They stood in a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand each other's hearts. The vast, star-dusted canopy of the heavens arched above them, a silent witness. Clara looked up at the Milky Way. A shimmering river of light spilled across the darkness. "Do you remember what I said to you?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet.
That day in Sundown Ridge, when you paid Silas."
"I remember every word you've ever said to me," he answered. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the starlight.
"You didn't buy my soul,"
she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the revelation.
"You loved it free."
The truth of it, so simple and so profound, settled over them. He reached out and took her hand. His own was trembling. He brought her rough, calloused fingers to his lips and held them there for a moment. "And you," he said, his voice thick and raw, "you gave mine a reason to keep living." He drew her closer, and they kissed. It was not a kiss of desperation, like the first one in the barn, born of fear and grief. This was a kiss of homecoming. It was quiet and deep and sure. It was a promise sealed not with words or with vows, but with a shared faith in the life they had built together. The prairie wind, which had howled with such fury on the night of the attack, now whispered gently through the valley. A soft lullaby for two souls who, against all odds, had found their shelter in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.